Chapter 20 of The Pirate by Sir Walter Scott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Of an outlaw this is the law, that men him take and bind, without pity hang to be, and wave with the wind. The Ballad of the Nut-Brown Maid. Mordaunt had caused the sentinels, who had been on duty since midnight, to be relieved ere the peep of day, and having given directions that the guard should be again changed at sunrise, he had retired to a small parlour, and placing his arms beside him, was slumbering in an easy-chair, when he felt himself pulled by the watch-cloak in which he was enveloped. "Is it sunrise?" said he, already, as, starting up, he discovered the first beams lying level upon the horizon. "Mordaunt," said a voice, every note of which thrilled to his heart. He turned his eyes on the speaker, and Brenda Troyle, to his joyful astonishment, stood before him. As he was about to address her eagerly, he was checked by observing the signs of sorrow and discomposure in her pale cheeks, trembling lips, and brimful eyes. "Mordaunt," she said, "you must do Minna and me a favour. You must allow us to leave the house quietly, and without alarming any one, in order to go as far as the standing stones of Stennis." "What freak can this be, dearest Brenda?" said Mordaunt, much amazed at the request. "Some Orcadian observation of superstition, perhaps. But the time is too dangerous, and my charge from your father too strict, that I should permit you to pass without his consent. Consider, dearest Brenda, I am a soldier on duty, and must obey orders." "Mordaunt," said Brenda, "this is no jesting matter. Minna's reason, nay, Minna's life, depends on your giving us this permission." "And for what purpose?" said Mordaunt. "Let me at least know that." "For a wild and a desperate purpose," replied Brenda. "It is that she may meet Cleveland." "Cleveland!" said Mordaunt. "Should the villain come ashore, he shall be welcomed with a shower of rifle balls. Let me within 100 yards of him," he added, grasping his piece, "and all the mischief he has done me shall be balanced with an ounce bullet." "His death will drive Minna frantic," said Brenda, "and him who injures Minna, Brenda will never again look upon." "This is madness, raving madness," said Mordaunt. "Consider your honour, consider your duty." "I can consider nothing but Minna's danger," said Brenda, breaking into a flood of tears. "Her former illness was nothing to the state she has been in all night. She holds in her hand his letter, written in characters of fire rather than of ink, imploring her to see him for a last farewell, as she would save a mortal body and an immortal soul, pledging himself for her safety, and declaring no power shall force him from the coast till he has seen her. You must let us pass." "It is impossible," replied Mordaunt, in great perplexity. "This ruffian has imprecations enough, doubtless, at his fingers' ends, but what better pledge has he to offer? I cannot permit Minna to go." "I suppose," said Brenda, somewhat reproachfully, while she dried her tears, yet still continued sobbing, "that there is something in what Norna spoke of betwixt Minna and you, and that you are too jealous of this poor wretch to allow him even to speak with her an instant before his departure." "You are unjust," said Mordaunt, hurt, and yet somewhat flattered by her suspicions. "You are as unjust as you are imprudent. You know, you cannot but know, that Minna is chiefly dear to me as your sister. Tell me, Brenda, and tell me truly, if I aid you in this folly, have you no suspicion of the pirate's faith?" "No, none," said Brenda. "If I had any, do you think I would urge you thus? He is wild and unhappy, but I think we may in this trust him." "Is the appointed place the Standing Stones, and the time daybreak?" again demanded Mordaunt. "It is, and the time is come," said Brenda. "For heaven's sake, let us depart." "I will myself," said Mordaunt, "relieve the sentinel at the front door for a few minutes, and suffer you to pass. You will not protract this interview, so full of danger?" "We will not," said Brenda. "And you, on your part, will not avail yourself of this unhappy man's venturing hither to harm or to seize him?" "Rely on my honour," said Mordaunt. "He shall have no harm, unless he offers any." "Then I go to call my sister," said Brenda, and quickly left the apartment. Mordaunt considered the matter for an instant, and then, going to the sentinel at the front door, he desired him to run instantly to the main guard and order the whole to turn out with their arms, to see the order obeyed, and to return when they were in readiness. Meantime, he himself, he said, would remain upon the post. During the interval of the sentinel's absence, the front door was slowly opened, and Minna and Brenda appeared, muffled in their mantles. The former leaned on her sister, and kept her face bent on the ground, as one who felt ashamed of the step she was about to take. Brenda also passed her lover in silence, but threw back upon him a look of gratitude and affection, which doubled, if possible, his anxiety for their safety. The sisters, in the meanwhile, passed out of sight of the house, when Minna, whose step till that time had been faint and feeble, began to erect her person and to walk with a pace so firm and so swift that Brenda, who had some difficulty to keep up with her, could not forbear remonstrating on the imprudence of hurrying her spirits and exhausting her force by such unnecessary haste. "Fear not, my dearest sister," said Minna. "The spirit which I now feel will and must sustain me through the dreadful interview. I could not but move with a drooping head and dejected pace, while I was in view of one who must necessarily deem me deserving of his pity or his scorn. But you know, my dearest Brenda, and Mordaunt shall also know, that the love I bore to that unhappy man was as pure as the rays of that sun that is now reflected on the waves, and I dare attest that glorious sun and yonder blue heaven to bear me witness, that, but to urge him to change his unhappy course of life, I had not, for all the temptations this round world holds, ever consented to see him more." As she spoke thus, in a tone which afforded much confidence to Brenda, the sisters attained the summit of a rising ground, whence they commanded a full view of the Orcadian Stonehenge, consisting of a huge circle and semicircle of the standing stones, as they are called, which already glimmered a greyish white in the rising sun, and projected far to the westward their long gigantic shadows. At another time the scene would have operated powerfully on the imaginative mind of Minna, and interested the curiosity, at least, of her less sensitive sister, but at this moment neither was at leisure to receive the impressions which this stupendous monument of antiquity is so well calculated to impress on the feelings of those who behold it. For they saw, in the lower lake, beneath what is termed the bridge of Broiskar, a boat well manned and armed, which had disembarked one of its crew, who advanced alone and wrapped in a naval cloak towards that monumental circle which they themselves were about to reach from another quarter. "They are many, and they are armed," said the startled Brenda in a whisper to her sister. "It is for precaution's sake," answered Minna, "which, alas, their condition renders but too necessary. Fear no treachery from him. That, at least, is not his vice." As she spoke, or shortly afterwards, she attained the centre of the circle, on which, in the midst of the tall erect pillars of rude stone that are raised around, lies one flat and prostrate, supported by short stone pillars, of which some relics are still visible, that had once served, perhaps, the purpose of an altar. "Here," she said, "in heathen times, if we may believe legends which have cost me but too dear, our ancestors offered sacrifices to heathen deities, and here will I, from my soul, renounce, abjure, and offer up to a better and a more merciful God than was known to them, the vain ideas with which my youthful imagination has been seduced." She stood by the prostrate table of stone, and saw Cleveland advance towards her with a timid pace and a downcast look, as different from his usual character and bearing as Minna's high air and lofty demeanour, and calm contemplative posture, were distant from those of the lovelorn and broken-hearted maiden, whose weight had almost borne down the support of her sister as she left the house of Stennis. If the belief of those is true who assign these singular monuments exclusively to the Druids, Minna might have seemed the Haxa, or high priestess of the order, from whom some champion of the tribe expected inauguration; or, if we hold the circles of Gothic and Scandinavian origin, she might have seemed a descended vision of Freya, the spouse of the thundering deity, before whom some bold sea-king or champion bent with an awe which no mere mortal terror could have inflicted upon him. Brenda, overwhelmed with inexpressible fear and doubt, remained a pace or two behind, anxiously observing the motions of Cleveland, and attending to nothing around, save to him and to her sister. Cleveland approached within 2 yards of Minna, and bent his head to the ground. There was a dead pause, until Minna said, in a firm but melancholy tone, "Unhappy man, why didst thou seek this aggravation of our woe? Depart in peace, and may Heaven direct thee to a better course than that which thy life has yet held." "Heaven will not aid me," said Cleveland, "excepting by your voice. I came hither rude and wild, scarce knowing that my trade, my desperate trade, was more criminal in the sight of man or of Heaven than that of those privateers whom your law acknowledges. I was bred in it, and but for the wishes you have encouraged me to form, I should have perhaps died in it, desperate and impenitent. Oh, do not throw me from you. Let me do something to redeem what I have done amiss, and do not leave your own work half finished." "Cleveland," said Minna, "I will not reproach you with abusing my inexperience, or with availing yourself of those delusions which the credulity of early youth had flung around me, and which led me to confound your fatal course of life with the deeds of our ancient heroes. Alas, when I saw your followers, that illusion was no more, but I do not upbraid you with its having existed. Go, Cleveland, detach yourself from those miserable wretches with whom you are associated, and believe me, that if Heaven yet grants you the means of distinguishing your name by one good or glorious action, there are eyes left in those lonely islands that will weep as much for joy as they must now do for sorrow." "And is this all?" said Cleveland. "And may I not hope that if I extricate myself from my present associates, if I can gain my pardon by being as bold in the right as I have been too often in the wrong cause, if after a term, I care not how long, but still a term which may have an end, I can boast of having redeemed my fame, may I not hope that Minna may forgive what my God and my country shall have pardoned?" "Never, Cleveland, never," said Minna, with the utmost firmness. "On this spot we part, and part for ever, and part without longer indulgence. Think of me as of one dead, if you continue as you now are. But if, which may Heaven grant, you change your fatal course, think of me then as one whose morning and evening prayers will be for your happiness, though she has lost her own. Farewell, Cleveland." He kneeled, overpowered by his own bitter feelings, to take the hand which she held out to him, and in that instant his confidant Bunch, starting from behind one of the large upright pillars, his eyes wet with tears, exclaimed, "Never saw such a parting scene on any stage, but I'll be damned if you make your exit as you expect." And so saying, ere Cleveland could employ either remonstrance or resistance, and indeed before he could get upon his feet, he easily secured him by pulling him down on his back, so that 2 or 3 of the boat's crew seized him by the arms and legs, and began to hurry him towards the lake. Minna and Brenda shrieked, and attempted to fly, but Derrick snatched up the former with as much ease as a falcon pounces on a pigeon, while Bunch, with an oath or two, which were intended to be of a consolatory nature, seized on Brenda, and the whole party, with 2 or 3 of the other pirates, who stealing from the water side had accompanied them on the ambuscade, began hastily to run towards the boat, which was left in charge of 2 of their number. Their course, however, was unexpectedly interrupted, and their criminal purpose entirely frustrated. When Mordaunt Murtown had turned out his guard in arms, it was with the natural purpose of watching over the safety of the 2 sisters. They had accordingly closely observed the motions of the pirates, and when they saw so many of them leave the boat and steal towards the place of rendezvous assigned to Cleveland, they naturally suspected treachery, and by cover of an old hollow way or trench, which perhaps had anciently been connected with the monumental circle, they had thrown themselves unperceived between the pirates and their boat. At the cries of the sisters, they started up and placed themselves in the way of the ruffians, presenting their pieces, which, notwithstanding they dared not fire, for fear of hurting the young ladies, secured as they were in the rude grasp of the marauders. Mordaunt, however, advanced with the speed of a wild deer on Bunch, who, loath to quit his prey, yet unable to defend himself otherwise, turned to his side, and that alternately exposing Brenda to the blows which Mordaunt offered at him. This defence, however, proved in vain against a youth possessed of the lightest foot and most active hand ever known in Shetland, and after a feint or two, Mordaunt brought the pirate to the ground with a stroke from the butt of the carabine, which he dared not use otherwise. At the same time, firearms were discharged on either side by those who were liable to no such cause of forbearance, and the pirates who had hold of Cleveland dropped him, naturally enough, to provide for their own defence or retreat. But they only added to the numbers of their enemies, for Cleveland, perceiving Minna in the arms of Derrick, snatched her from the ruffian with one hand, and with the other shot him dead on the spot. 2 or 3 more of the pirates fell or were taken. The rest fled to their boat, pushed off, then turned their broadside to the shore, and fired repeatedly on the Orcadian party, which they returned with little injury on either side. Meanwhile, Mordaunt, having first seen that the sisters were at liberty and in full flight towards the house, advanced on Cleveland with his cutlass drawn. The pirate presented a pistol, and calling out at the same time, "Mordaunt, I never missed my aim," he fired into the air, and threw it into the lake, then drew his cutlass, brandishing it round his head, and flung that also as far as his arm could send it in the same direction. Yet such was the universal belief of his personal strength and resources, that Mordaunt still used precaution, as, advancing on Cleveland, he asked if he surrendered. "I surrender to no man," said the pirate captain, "but you may see I have thrown away my weapons." He was immediately seized by some of the Orcadians without his offering any resistance, but the instant interference of Mordaunt prevented his being roughly treated or bound. The victors conducted him to a well-secured upper apartment in the house of Stennis, and placed a sentinel at the door. Bunch and Fletcher, both of whom had been stretched on the field during the skirmish, were lodged in the same chamber, and 2 prisoners, who appeared of lower rank, were confined in a vault belonging to the mansion. Without pretending to describe the joy of Magnus Troil, who, when awakened by the noise and firing, found his daughter safe and his enemy a prisoner, we shall only say it was so great that he forgot, for the time at least, to inquire what circumstances were those which had placed them in danger, that he hugged Mordaunt to his breast 1,000 times as their preserver, and swore as often by the bones of his sainted namesake, that if he had 1,000 daughters, so tight a lad and so true a friend should have the choice of them, let Lady Glororum say what she would. A very different scene was passing in the prison chamber of the unfortunate Cleveland and his associates. The captain sat by the window, his eyes bent on the prospect of the sea which it presented, and was seemingly so intent on it as to be insensible of the presence of the others. Jack Bunch stood meditating some ends of verse in order to make his advances towards a reconciliation with Cleveland, for he began to be sensible, from the consequences, that the part he had played towards his captain, however well intended, was neither lucky in its issue nor likely to be well taken. His admirer and adherent Fletcher lay half asleep, as it seemed, on a truckle bed in the room, without the least attempt to interfere in the conversation which ensued. "Nay, but speak to me, Clement," said the penitent lieutenant, "if it but be to swear at me for my stupidity." "What, not an oath? Nay, then the world goes hard, if Clifford cannot spare his friends an oath." "I prithee, peace and begone," said Cleveland. "I have one bosom friend left yet, and you will make me bestow its contents on you or on myself." "I have it," said Bunch, "I have it," and on he went in the vein of Jaffier. "Then, by the hell I merit, I'll not leave thee, till to thyself at least thou art reconciled, however thy resentment deal with me." "I pray you once more to be silent," said Cleveland. "Is it not enough that you have undone me with your treachery, but you must stun me with your silly buffoonery? I would not have believed you would have lifted a finger against me, Jack, of any man or devil in yonder unhappy ship." "Who, I?" exclaimed Bunch. "I lift a finger against you? And if I did, it was in pure love, and to make you the happiest fellow that ever trode a deck, with your mistress beside you, and 50 fine fellows at your command. Here is Dick Fletcher can bear witness I did all for the best, if he would but speak, instead of lolloping there like a Dutch dogger laid up to be careened. Get up, Dick, and speak for me, won't you?" "Why, yes, Jack Bunch," answered Fletcher, raising himself with difficulty, and speaking feebly. "I will, if I can, and I always knew you spoke and did for the best, but howsomedever, do you see, it has turned out for the worst for me this time, for I am bleeding to death, I think." "You cannot be such an ass," said Jack Bunch, springing to his assistance, as did Cleveland. But human aid came too late. He sunk back on the bed, and turning on his face, expired without a groan. "I always thought him a damned fool," said Bunch, as he wiped a tear from his eye, "but never such a consummate idiot as to hop the perch so sillily. I have lost the best follower," and he again wiped his eye. Cleveland looked on the dead body, the rugged features of which had remained unaltered by the death-pang. "A bulldog," he said, "of the true British breed, and with a better counsellor would have been a better man." "You may say that of some other folks too, Captain, if you are minded to do them justice," said Bunch. "I may indeed, and especially of yourself," said Cleveland, in reply. "Why, then, say, 'Jack, I forgive you,'" said Bunch. "It's but a short word, and soon spoken." "I forgive you from all my soul, Jack," said Cleveland, who had resumed his situation at the window, "and the rather that your folly is of little consequence. The morning is come that must bring ruin on us all." "What? You are thinking of the old woman's prophecy you spoke of," said Bunch. "It will soon be accomplished," answered Cleveland. "Come hither. What do you take yon large square-rigged vessel for, that you see doubling the headland on the east, and opening the bay of Stromness?" "Why, I can't make her well out," said Bunch, "but yonder is old Gough. Takes her for a West Indiaman loaded with rum and sugar, I suppose, for damn me if he does not slip cable and stand out to her." "Instead of running into the shoal water, which was his only safety," said Cleveland. "The fool, the dotard, the drivelling drunken idiot, he will get his flip hot enough, for yon is the Halcyon. See, she hoists her colours and fires a broadside, and there will soon be an end of the Fortune's favourite. I only hope they will fight her to the last plank. The boatswain used to be staunch enough, and so is Gough, though an incarnate demon. Now she shoots away with all the sail she can spread, and that shows some sense. Up goes the Jolly Hodge, the old black flag, with the Death's Head and hourglass, and that shows some spunk," added his comrade. "The hourglass is turned for us, Jack, for this bout. Our sand is running fast. Fire away yet, my roving lads, the deep sea or the blue sky, rather than a rope and a yardarm." There was a moment of anxious and dead silence. The sloop, though hard pressed, maintaining still a running flight, and the frigate continuing in full chase, but scarce returning a shot. At length the vessels neared each other so as to show that the man of war intended to board the sloop, instead of sinking her, probably to secure the plunder which might be in the private vessel. "Now, Gough, now, boatswain!" exclaimed Cleveland, in an ecstasy of impatience, and as if they could have heard his commands. "Stand by sheets and tacks. Rake her with a broadside when you are under her bows, then about ship and go off on the other tack like a wild goose. The sails shiver, the helm's a lee. Ah, deep seas sink the lubbers. They miss stays, and the frigate runs them aboard. Accordingly, the various manoeuvres of the chase had brought them so near that Cleveland, with his spyglass, could see the man-of-war's men boarding by the yards and bowsprit in irresistible numbers, their naked cutlasses flashing in the sun, when at that critical moment both ships were enveloped in a cloud of thick black smoke, which suddenly arose on board the captured pirate. "Exeunt omnes," said Bunch, with clasped hands. "There went the Fortune's favourite, ship and crew," said Cleveland at the same instant. But the smoke immediately clearing away showed that the damage had only been partial, and that from want of a sufficient quantity of powder, the pirates had failed in their desperate attempt to blow up their vessel with the Halcyon. Shortly after the action was over, Captain Weatherport of the Halcyon sent an officer and a party of marines to the house of Stennis to demand from the little garrison the pirate seamen who were their prisoners, and in particular Cleveland and Bunch, who acted as captain and lieutenant of the gang. This was a demand which was not to be resisted, though Magnus Troil could have wished sincerely that the roof under which he lived had been allowed as an asylum at least to Cleveland. But the officer's orders were peremptory, and he added it was Captain Weatherport's intention to land the other prisoners and send the whole, with a sufficient escort, across the island to Kirkwall in order to undergo an examination there before the civil authorities, previous to their being sent off to London for trial at the High Court of Admiralty. Magnus could therefore only intercede for good usage to Cleveland, and that he might not be stripped or plundered, which the officer, struck by his good mien, and compassionating his situation, readily promised. The honest U-Dollar would have said something in the way of comfort to Cleveland himself, but he could not find words to express it, and only shook his head. "Old friend," said Cleveland, "you may have much to complain of, yet you pity instead of exulting over me. For the sake of you and yours, I will never harm human being more. Take this from me, my last hope, but my last temptation also." He drew from his bosom a pocket pistol and gave it to Magnus Troil. "Remember me too. But no, let every one forget me. I am your prisoner, sir," he said to the officer. "And I also," said poor Bunch, and putting on a theatrical countenance, he ranted, with no very perceptible faltering in his tone, the words of Pierre: "Captain, you should be a gentleman of honour. Keep off the rabble, that I may have room to entertain my fate and die with decency." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Pirate by Sir Walter Scott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Joy, joy in London now. Southey. The news of the capture of the rover reached Kirkwall about an hour before noon, and filled all men with wonder and with joy. Little business was that day done at the fair, whilst people of all ages and occupations streamed from the place to see the prisoners as they were marched towards Kirkwall, and to triumph in the different appearance which they now bore from that which they had formerly exhibited when ranting, swaggering, and bullying in the streets of that town. The bayonets of the marines were soon seen to glisten in the sun, And then came on the melancholy troop of captives, handcuffed two and two together. Their finery had been partly torn from them by their captors, partly hung in rags about them. Many were wounded and covered with blood, many blackened and scorched with the explosion by which a few of the most desperate had in vain striven to blow up the vessel. Most of them seemed sullen and impenitent. Some were more becomingly affected with their condition, and a few braved it out, and sung the same ribald songs to which they had made the streets of Kirkwall ring when they were in their frolics. The boatswain and Gough, coupled together, exhausted themselves in threats and imprecations against each other, the former charging Gough with want of seamanship, and the latter alleging that the boatswain had prevented him from firing the powder that was stowed forward, and so sending them all to the other world together. Last came Cleveland and Bunch, who were permitted to walk unshackled. The decent melancholy yet resolved manner of the former, contrasting strongly with the stage strut and swagger which poor Jack thought it fitting to assume, in order to conceal some less dignified emotions. The former was looked upon with compassion, the latter with a mixture of scorn and pity, while most of the others inspired horror and even fear by their looks and their language. There was one individual in Kirkwall who was so far from hastening to see the sight which attracted all eyes, that he was not even aware of the event which agitated the town. This was the elder Murtown, whose residence Kirkwall had been for 2 or 3 days, part of which had been spent in attending to some judicial proceedings undertaken at the instance of the procurator fiscal against that grave professor Bryce Snailsfoot, in consequence of an inquisition into the proceedings of this worthy traitor. Cleveland's chest, with his papers and other matters therein contained, had been restored to Murtown as the lawful custodier thereof, until the right owner should be in a situation to establish his right to them. Murtown was at first desirous to throw back upon justice the charge which she was disposed to entrust him with, but on perusing 1 or 2 of the papers he hastily changed his mind, in broken words requested the magistrate to let the chest be sent to his lodgings, and hastening homeward bolted himself into the room to consider and digest the singular information which chance had thus conveyed to him, and which increased in a 10-fold degree his impatience for an interview with the mysterious Norna of the fitful head. It may be remembered that she had required of him, when they met in the churchyard of St. Ninian, to attend in the outer aisle of the Cathedral of St. Magnus at the hour of noon on the 5th day of the fair of St. Ola, there to meet a person by whom the fate of Mordaunt would be explained to him. It must be herself, he said, and that I should see her at this moment is indispensable. How to find her sooner I know not, and better lose a few hours even in this exigence than offend her by a premature attempt to force myself on her presence. Long, therefore, before noon, long before the town of Kirkwall was agitated by the news of the events on the other side of the island, the elder Murtown was pacing the deserted aisle of the cathedral, awaiting, with agonizing eagerness, the expected communication from Norna. The bell tolled 12, no door opened, no one was seen to enter the cathedral, but the last sounds had not ceased to reverberate through the vaulted roof, when, gliding from one of the interior side aisles, Norna stood before him. Murtown, indifferent to the apparent mystery of her sudden approach, with the secret of which the reader is acquainted, went up to her at once with the earnest ejaculation, "Ulla, Ulla Troil, aid me to save our unhappy boy." "To Ulla Troil," said Norna, "I answer not. I gave that name to the winds on the night that cost me a father." "Speak not of that night of horror," said Murtown. "We have need of our reason. Let us not think on recollections which may destroy it, but aid me, if thou canst, to save our unfortunate child." "Vaughan," answered Norna, "he is already saved, long since saved. Think you a mother's hand, and that of such a mother as I am, would await your crawling, tardy, ineffectual assistance? No, Vaughan, I make myself known to you, but to show my triumph over you. It is the only revenge which the powerful Norna permits herself to take for the wrongs of Ulla Troil." "Have you indeed saved him from the murderous crew?" said Murtown or Vaughan. "Speak, and speak truth. I will believe every thing, all you would require me to assent to. Prove to me only he is escaped and safe." "Escaped and safe by my means," said Norna. "Safe, and in assurance of an honoured and happy alliance. Yes, great unbeliever. Yes, wise and self-opinioned infidel. These were the works of Norna. I knew you many a year since, but never had I made myself known to you save with the triumphant consciousness of having controlled the destiny that threatened my son. All combined against him, planets which threatened drowning, combinations which menaced blood, but my skill was superior to all. I arranged, I combined, I found means, I made them. Each disaster has been averted. And what infidel on earth, or stubborn demon beyond the bounds of earth, shall hereafter deny my power?" The wild ecstasy with which she spoke so much resembled triumphant insanity, that Murtown answered, "Were your pretensions less lofty, and your speech more plain, I should be better assured of my son's safety." "Doubt on, vain skeptic," said Norna, "and yet know that not only is our son safe, but vengeance is mine, though I sought it not, vengeance on the powerful implement of the darker influences by whom my schemes were so often thwarted, and even the life of my son endangered. Yes, take it as a guarantee of the truth of my speech, that Cleveland, the pirate Cleveland, even now enters Kirkwall as a prisoner, and will soon expiate with his life the having shed blood which is of kin to Norna's." "Who didst thou say was prisoner?" exclaimed Murtown, with a voice of thunder. "Who, woman, didst thou say should expiate his crimes with his life?" "Cleveland, the pirate Cleveland," answered Norna, "and by me, whose counsel he scorned, he has been permitted to meet his fate." "Thou most wretched of women," said Murtown, speaking from behind his clenched teeth, "thou hast slain thy son as well as thy father." "My son? What son? What mean you? Mordaunt is your son, your only son," exclaimed Norna. "Is he not? Tell me quickly, is he not?" "Mordaunt is indeed my son," said Murtown. "The laws, at least, gave him to me as such. But, oh, unhappy Ulla! Cleveland is your son as well as mine, blood of our blood, bone of our bone, and if you have given him to death, I will end my wretched life along with him." "Stay, hold, stop, Vaughan," said Norna. "I am not yet overcome. Prove but to me the truth of what you say. I would find help if I should evoke hell. but prove your words, else believe them I cannot. Thou help, wretched overweening woman, in what have thy combinations and thy stratagems, the legerdemain of lunacy, the mere quackery of insanity, in what have these involved thee? And yet I will speak to thee as reasonable. Nay, I will admit thee as powerful. Hear then, Ulla, the proofs which you demand, and find a remedy if thou canst. When I fled from Orkney, he continued, after a pause, it is now 25 years since, I bore with me the unhappy offspring to whom you had given light. It was sent to me by one of your kinswomen with an account of your illness, which was soon followed by a generally received belief of your death. It avails not to tell in what misery I left Europe. I found refuge in Hispaniola, wherein a fair young Spaniard undertook the task of comforter. I married her. She became mother of the youth called Mordaunt Murtown. You married her, said Norna, in a tone of deep reproach. I did, Ulla, answered Murtown, but you were avenged. She proved faithless, and her infidelity left me in doubts whether the child she bore had a right to call me father. But I was also avenged. You murdered her, said Norna, with a dreadful shriek. I did that, said Murtown, without a more direct reply, which made an instant flight from Hispaniola necessary. Your son I carried with me to Tortuga, where we had a small settlement. Mordaunt Vaughan, my son by marriage, about 3 or 4 years younger, was residing in Port Royal for the advantages of an English education. I resolved never to see him again, but I continued to support him. Our settlement was plundered by the Spaniards when Clement was but 15. Want came to aid despair and a troubled conscience. I became a corsair and involved Clement in the same desperate trade. His skill and bravery, though then a mere boy, gained him a separate command, and after a lapse of 2 or 3 years, while we were on different cruises, my crew rose on me and left me for dead on the beach of one of the Bermudas. I recovered, however, and my first enquiries after a tedious illness were after Clement. He, I heard, had been also marooned by a rebellious crew and put ashore on a desert islet to perish with want. I believed he had so perished. And what assures you that he did not? Said Ulla. Or how comes this Cleveland to be identified with Vaughan? To change a name is common with such adventurers, answered Murtown, and Clement had apparently found that of Vaughan had become too notorious, and this change, in his case, prevented me from hearing any tidings of him. It was then that remorse seized me, and that, detesting all nature, but especially the sex to which Louisa belonged, I resolved to do penance in the wild islands of Shetland for the rest of my life. To subject myself to fasts and to the scourge was the advice of the holy Catholic priests, whom I consulted. But I devised a nobler penance. I determined to bring with me the unhappy boy Mordaunt, and to keep always before me the living memorial of my misery and my guilt. I have done so, and I have thought over both, till reason has often trembled on her throne. And now, to drive me to utter madness, my Clement, my own, my undoubted son, revives from the dead to be consigned to an infamous death by the machinations of his own mother. Away, away, said Norna with a laugh, when she heard the story to an end. This is a legend framed by the old corsair to interest my aid in favor of a guilty comrade. How could I mistake Mordaunt for my son, their ages being so different? The dark complexion and manly stature may have done much, said Basil Murtown. "Strong imagination must have done the rest." "But give me proofs that this Cleveland is my son, and believe me, this sun shall sooner sink in the east than they shall have power to harm a hair of his head." "These papers, these journals," said Murtown, offering the pocket-book. "I cannot read them," she said, after an effort. "My brain is dizzy." "Clement has also tokens which you may remember, but they must have become the booty of his captors. He had a silver box with a runic inscription, with which in far other days you presented me a golden chaplet." "A box," said Norna hastily. "Cleveland gave me one but a day since. I have never looked at it till now." Eagerly she pulled it out, eagerly examined the legend around the lid, and as eagerly exclaimed, "They may now indeed call me rhyme kenner, for by this rhyme I know myself murderess of my son as well as of my father." The conviction of the strong delusion under which she had labored was so overwhelming that she sunk down at the foot of one of the pillars. Murtown shouted for help, though in despair of receiving any. The sexton, however, entered, and, hopeless of all assistance from Norna, the distracted father rushed out to learn, if possible, the fate of his son. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Pirate by Sir Walter Scott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Deon Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Go, some of you cry a reprieve. Beggar's Opera. Captain Weatherport had before this time reached Kirkwall in person, and was received with great joy and thankfulness by the magistrates who had assembled in council for the purpose. The provost, in particular, expressed himself delighted with the providential arrival of the Halcyon at the very conjuncture when the pirate could not escape her. The captain looked a little surprised, and said, "For that, sir, you may thank the information you yourself supplied." "That I supplied?" said the provost, somewhat astonished. "Yes, sir," answered Captain Weatherport. "I understand you to be George Torfey, Chief Magistrate of Kirkwall, who subscribes this letter." The astonished provost took the letter addressed to Captain Weatherport of the Halcyon, stating the arrival, force, etc., of the pirate's vessel, but adding that they had heard of the Halcyon being on the coast, and that they were on their guard and ready to baffle her by going among the shoals and through the islands and holms where the frigate could not easily follow, and at worst they were desperate enough to propose running the sloop ashore and blowing her up, by which much booty and treasure would be lost to the captors. The letter therefore suggested that the Halcyon should cruise betwixt Duncansby Head and Cape Wrath for 2 or 3 days, to relieve the pirates of the alarm her neighbourhood occasioned, and lull them into security, the more especially as the letter writer knew it to be their intention, if the frigate left the coast, to go into Stromness Bay, and there put their guns ashore for some necessary repairs, or even for careening their vessel if they could find means. The letter concluded by assuring Captain Weatherport that if he could bring his frigate into Stromness Bay on the morning of the 24th of August, he would have a good bargain of the pirates. If sooner, he was not unlikely to miss them. "This letter is not of my writing or subscribing, Captain Weatherport," said the provost, "nor would I have ventured to advise any delay in your coming hither." The captain was surprised in his turn. All I know is that it reached me when I was in the Bay of Thurso, and that I gave the boat's crew that brought it $5 for crossing the Pentland Firth in very rough weather. They had a dumb dwarf as coxswain, the ugliest urchin my eyes ever opened upon. I give you much credit for the accuracy of your intelligence, Mr. Provost." "It is lucky as it is," said the Provost. "Yet I question whether the writer of this letter would not rather that you had found the nest cold and the bird flown." So saying, he handed the letter to Magnus Troil, who returned it with a smile, but without any observation, aware, doubtless, with the sagacious reader, that Norna had her own reasons for calculating with accuracy on the date of the Halcyon's arrival. Without puzzling himself farther concerning a circumstance which seemed inexplicable, the captain requested that the examinations might proceed, and Cleveland and Altamont, as he chose to be called, were brought up the first of the pirate crew, on the charge of having acted as captain and lieutenant. They had just commenced the examination, when after some expostulation with the officers who kept the door, Basil Murtown burst into the apartment and exclaimed, "Take the old victim for the young one. I am Basil Vaughan, too well known on the Windward station. Take my life, and spare my sons." All were astonished, and none more than Magnus Troil, who hastily explained to the magistrates and Captain Weatherport that this gentleman had been living peaceably and honestly on the mainland of Shetland for many years. "In that case," said the captain, "I wash my hands of the poor man, for he is safe under 2 proclamations of mercy, and by my soul, when I see them, the father and his offspring, hanging on each other's neck, I wish I could say as much for the son." "But how is it? How can it be?" said the provost. "We always called the old man Murtown, and the young Cleveland, and now it seems they are both named Vaughan." "Vaughan," answered Magnus, "is a name which I have some reason to remember, and from what I have lately heard from my cousin Norna, that old man has a right to bear it." "And I trust the young man also," said the captain, who had been looking over a memorandum. "Listen to me a moment," added he, addressing the younger Vaughan, whom we have hitherto called Cleveland. "Hark you, sir, your name is said to be Clement Vaughan. Are you the same who, then a mere boy, commanded a party of rovers, who about 8 or 9 years ago pillaged a Spanish village called Campoa, on the Spanish Main, with the purpose of seizing some treasure?" "It will avail me nothing to deny it," answered the prisoner. "No," said Captain Weatherport, "but it may do you service to admit it. Well, the muleteers escaped with the treasure while you were engaged in protecting, at the hazard of your own life, the honour of 2 Spanish ladies against the brutality of your followers. Do you remember anything of this?" "I am sure I do," said Jack Bunch, "for our captain here was marooned for his gallantry, and I narrowly escaped flogging and pickling for having taken his part." "When these points are established," said Captain Weatherport, "Vaughan's life is safe. The women he saved were persons of quality, daughters to the governor of the province, and application was long since made by the grateful Spaniard to our government for favour to be shown to their preserver. I had special orders about Clement Vaughan when I had a commission for cruising upon the pirates in the West Indies 6 or 7 years since. But Vaughan was gone then as a name amongst them, and I heard enough of Cleveland in his room. However, Captain, be you Cleveland or Vaughan, I think that, as the Campoa hero, I can assure you a free pardon when you arrive in London." Cleveland bowed, and the blood mounted to his face. Murtown fell on his knees and exhausted himself in thanksgiving to heaven. They were removed amidst the sympathizing sobs of the spectators. "And now, good Master Lieutenant, what have you got to say for yourself?" said Captain Weatherport to the ci devant Roscius. "Why, little or nothing, please your honour, only that I wish your honour could find my name in that book of mercy you have in your hand, for I stood by Captain Clement Vaughan in that Campoa business." "You call yourself Frederick Altamont," said Captain Weatherport. "I can see no such name here. One John Bounce, or Bunch, the lady put on her tablets." "Why, that is me. That is I myself, Captain. I can prove it, and I am determined, though the sound be something plebeian, rather to live Jack Bunch than to hang as Frederick Altamont." "In that case," said the captain, "I can give you some hopes as John Bunch." "Thank your noble worship!" shouted Bunch. Then changing his tone, he said, "Ah, since an alias has such virtue, poor Dick Fletcher might have come off as Timothy Tugmutton, but howsomedever, do you see, to use his own phrase." "Away with the lieutenant," said the captain, "and bring forward Gough and the other fellows. There will be ropes reeved for some of them, I think." And this prediction promised to be amply fulfilled, so strong was the proof which was brought against them. The Halcyon was accordingly ordered round to carry the whole prisoners to London, for which she set sail in the course of 2 days. During the time that the unfortunate Cleveland remained at Kirkwall, he was treated with civility by the captain of the Halcyon, and the kindness of his old acquaintance Magnus Troyle, who knew in secret how closely he was allied to his blood, pressed on him accommodations of every kind more than he could be prevailed on to accept. Norna, whose interest in the unhappy prisoner was still more deep, was at this time unable to express it. The sexton had found her lying on the pavement in a swoon, and when she recovered, her mind for the time had totally lost its equipoise, and it became necessary to place her under the restraint of watchful attendants. Of the sisters of Bergwestra, Cleveland only heard that they remained ill in consequence of the fright to which they had been subjected, until the evening before the Halcyon sailed, when he received, by a private conveyance, the following billet: "Farewell, Cleveland, we part for ever, and it is right that we should. Be virtuous and be happy. The delusions which a solitary education and limited acquaintance with the modern world had spread around me are gone and dissipated for ever. But in you, I am sure, I have been thus far free from error, that you are one to whom good is naturally more attractive than evil, and whom only necessity, example, and habit have forced into your late course of life. Think of me as one who no longer exists, unless you should become as much the object of general praise as now of general reproach, and then think of me as one who will rejoice in your reviving fame, though she must never see you more." The note was signed M.T., and Cleveland, with a deep emotion, which he testified even by tears, read it 100 times over, and then clasped it to his bosom. Mordaunt Murtown heard by letter from his father, but in a very different style. Basil bade him farewell for ever, and acquitted him henceforward of the duties of a son, as one on whom he, notwithstanding the exertions of many years, had found himself unable to bestow the affections of a parent. The letter informed him of a recess in the old house of Jarlshof, in which the writer had deposited a considerable quantity of specie and of treasure, which he desired Mordaunt to use as his own. You need not fear, the letter bore, either that you lay yourself under obligation to me, or that you are sharing the spoils of piracy. What is now given over to you is almost entirely the property of your deceased mother, Louisa Gonzago, and is yours by every right. Let us forgive each other, was the conclusion, as they who must meet no more. And they never met more, for the elder Murtown, against whom no charge was ever preferred, disappeared after the fate of Cleveland was determined, and was generally believed to have retired into a foreign convent. The fate of Cleveland will be most briefly expressed in a letter which Minna received within 2 months after the Halcyon left Kirkwall. The family were then assembled at Berg Westra, and Mordaunt was a member of it for the time, the good Udollar thinking he could never sufficiently repay the activity which he had shown in the defence of his daughters. Norna, then beginning to recover from her temporary alienation of mind, was a guest in the family, and Minna, who was sedulous in her attention upon this unfortunate victim of mental delusion, was seated with her, watching each symptom of returning reason, when the letter we allude to was placed in her hands. Minna, it said, dearest Minna, farewell and forever. Believe me, I never meant you wrong, never. From the moment I came to know you, I resolved to detach myself from my hateful comrades, and had framed 1,000 schemes, which have proved as vain as they deserved to be. For why or how should the fate of her that is so lovely, pure, and innocent be involved with that of one so guilty? Of these dreams I will speak no more. The stern reality of my situation is much milder than I either expected or deserved, and the little good I did has outweighed, in the minds of honorable and merciful judges, much that was evil and criminal. I have not only been exempted from the ignominious death to which several of my compeers are sentenced, but Captain Weatherport, about once more to sail for the Spanish Main, under the apprehension of an immediate war with that country, has generously solicited and obtained permission to employ me, and 2 or 3 more of my less guilty associates, in the same service, a measure recommended to him by his own generous compassion, and to others by our knowledge of the coast and of local circumstances, which, by whatever means acquired, we now hope to use for the service of our country. Minna, you will hear my name pronounced with honor, or you will never hear it again. If virtue can give happiness, I need not wish it to you, for it is yours already. Farewell, Minna. Minna wept so bitterly over this letter that it attracted the attention of the convalescent Norna. She snatched it from the hand of her kinswoman, and read it over at first with the confused air of one to whom it conveyed no intelligence, then with a dawn of recollection, then with a burst of mingled joy and grief, in which she dropped it from her hand. Minna snatched it up and retired with her treasure to her own apartment. From that time Norna appeared to assume a different character. Her dress was changed to one of a more simple and less imposing appearance. Her dwarf was dismissed, with ample provision for his future comfort. She showed no desire of resuming her erratic life, and directed her observatory, as it might be called, on Fitful Head, to be dismantled. She refused the name of Norna, and would only be addressed by her real appellation of Ulla Troil. But the most important change remained behind. Formerly, from the dreadful dictates of spiritual despair arising out of the circumstances of her father's death, she seemed to have considered herself as an outcast from divine grace, Besides, that, enveloped in the vain occult sciences which she pretended to practice, her study, like that of Chaucer's physician, had been but little in the Bible. Now the sacred volume was seldom laid aside, and to the poor ignorant people who came as formerly to invoke her power over the elements, she only replied, "The winds are in the hollow of his hand." Her conversion was not perhaps altogether rational, for this the state of a mind disordered by such a complication of horrid incidents probably prevented, but it seemed to be sincere and was certainly useful. She appeared deeply to repent of her former presumptuous attempts to interfere with the course of human events, superintended as they are by far higher powers, and expressed bitter compunction when such her former pretensions were in any manner recalled to her memory. She still showed a partiality to Mordaunt, though perhaps arising chiefly from habit, nor was it easy to know how much or how little she remembered of the complicated events in which she had been connected. When she died, which was about 4 years after the events we have commemorated, it was found that, at the special and earnest request of Minna Troyle, she had conveyed her very considerable property to Brenda. A clause in her will specially directed that all the books, implements of her laboratory, and other things connected with her former studies should be committed to the flames. About 2 years before Norna's death, Brenda was wedded to Mordaunt Murtown. It was some time before old Magnus Troyle, with all his affection for his daughter and all his partiality for Mordaunt, was able frankly to reconcile himself to this match. But Mordaunt's accomplishments were peculiarly to the Udallers' taste, and the old man felt the impossibility of supplying his place in his family so absolutely, that at length his Norse blood gave way to the natural feeling of the heart, and he comforted his pride while he looked around him, and saw what he considered as the encroachments of the Scottish gentry upon the country, so Zetland is fondly termed by its inhabitants, that as well his daughter married the son of an English pirate as of a Scottish thief, in scornful allusion to the Highland and border families to whom Zetland owes many respectable landholders, but whose ancestors were generally esteemed more renowned for ancient family and high courage than for accurately regarding the trifling distinctions of meum and tuum. The jovial old man lived to the extremity of human life with the happy prospect of a numerous succession in the family of his younger daughter, and having his board cheered alternately by the minstrelsy of Claude Halcrow and enlightened by the lucubrations of Mr. Triptolemus Yellowly, who, laying aside his high pretensions, was, when he became better acquainted with the manners of the islanders, and remembered the various misadventures which had attended his premature attempts at reformation, an honest and useful representative of his principle, and never so happy as when he could escape from the spare commons of his sister Barbara to the genial table of the Udaller. Barbara's temper also was much softened by the unexpected restoration of the horn of silver coins, the property of Norna, which she had concealed in the mansion of old Stouerberg for achieving some of her mysterious plans, but which she now restored to those by whom it had been accidentally discovered, with an intimation, however, that it would again disappear unless a reasonable portion was expended on the sustenance of the family, a precaution to which Tronda Dronsdatter, probably an agent of Norna's, owed her escape from a slow and wasting death by inanition. Mordaunt and Brenda were as happy as our mortal condition permits us to be, They admired and loved each other, enjoyed easy circumstances, had duties to discharge which they did not neglect, and clear in conscience, as light of heart, laughed, sung, danced, doffed the world aside, and bid it pass. But Minna, the high-minded and imaginative Minna, she, gifted with such depth of feeling and enthusiasm, yet doomed to see both blighted in early youth, because with the inexperience of a disposition equally romantic and ignorant, she had built the fabric of her happiness on a quicksand instead of a rock, could she be happy? Reader, she was happy, for whatever may be alleged to the contrary by the skeptic and the scorner, to each duty performed there is assigned a degree of mental peace and high consciousness of honorable exertion, corresponding to the difficulty of the task accomplished. That rest of the body which succeeds to hard and industrious toil is not to be compared to the repose which the spirit enjoys under similar circumstances. Her resignation, however, and the constant attention which she paid to her father, her sister, the afflicted Norna, and to all who had claims on her, were neither Minna's sole nor her most precious source of comfort. Like Norna, but under a more regulated judgment, she learned to exchange the visions of wild enthusiasm which had exerted and misled her imagination for a truer and purer connection with the world beyond us than could be learned from the sagas of heathen bards or the visions of later rhymers. To this she owed the support by which she was enabled, after various accounts of the honorable and gallant conduct of Cleveland, to read with resignation, and even with a sense of comfort, mingled with sorrow, that he had at length fallen, leading the way in a gallant and honorable enterprise, which was successfully accomplished by those companions to whom his determined bravery had opened the road. Bunch, his fantastic follower in good, as formerly in evil, transmitted an account to Minna of this melancholy event, in terms which showed that though his head was weak, his heart had not been utterly corrupted by the lawless life which he had for some time led, or at least that it had been amended by the change, and that he himself had gained credit and promotion in the same action, seemed to be of little consequence to him, compared with the loss of his old captain and comrade. Minna read the intelligence and thanked heaven, even while the eyes which she lifted up were streaming with tears, that the death of Cleveland had been in the bed of honor. Nay, she even had the courage to add her gratitude that he had been snatched from a situation of temptation ere circumstances had overcome his new-born virtue. And so strongly did his reflection operate, that her life, after the immediate pain of this event had passed away, seemed not only as resigned, but even more cheerful than before. Her thoughts, however, were detached from the world, and only visited it with an interest like that which guardian spirits take for their charge in behalf of those friends with whom she lived in love, or of the poor whom she could serve and comfort. Thus passed her life, enjoying from all who approached her an affection enhanced by reverence, insomuch that when her friends sorrowed for her death, which arrived at a late period of her existence, they were comforted by the fond reflection that the humanity which she then laid down was the only circumstance which had placed her, in the words of Scripture, a little lower than the angels. End of chapter 22. End of The Pirate by Sir Walter Scott.